New World just came out, and Shroud's pumping out 14-hour days back to back.
Yeah.
And even the other day, he was like saying on his, he's like, man, I'm so worn out, but I have to keep going. It's also this mentality in the back of your head, like, if I'm not going to do it, then the viewers are going to go somewhere else as well.
Well, that's the thing with...
If I'm not gonna do it, then the viewers will go somewhere else. The exact mentality that can ruin any entertainment media. If I don't do it, then someone else will do that, and they will get all the benefits, and not me. That thought is the bane of all art forms, following some topical trends that everyone is hopping onto just to reap all those sweet cash by doing similar activities in a form of media that thrives from diversity in ideas. Those exact practices were what made the mainstream media, well, feel so mainstream. The endless hunger to cater to an ever-growing large audience made all of them feel devoid of any originality, which is why some people gravitated towards online content, or at least the ones who had a sensible taste and didn't just consume whatever was doing big numbers. A medium which gave regular people the opportunity to do whatever in the hell they felt like doing, and that exact homely feeling is what made them so popular. Something that wasn't driven by making a huge sum of money. But it seems like recently, more than ever, that there is a huge lack in the creative department from any online platform, mainly being YouTube. That independent feeling which is protrude all over this once wonderful platform seems to be lacking. Of course, there are some exceptions. Channels who truly seems to enjoy making whatever they deem to see fit, which can quench their thirst of creativity. But in general, the majority are either busy buying funky looking gems, while the other half is having a grand old time making fun of them, which ends with both of those groups making more money, with the viewers getting the short end of the stick in that deal. Well, enough of that rant of mine. But don't worry, all of that aligns with the main topic of this video. No matter what the medium is, there is always someone amongst all those shallow mainstream people who acts as a beacon of hope for that art form, letting their work speak for the caliber of talent that they possess, outshining all the dull counterparts of that genre, and outperforming all those so-called competition. And one of those type of people in the film industry is Guillermo Del Toro, a Mexican director, producer, screenwriter, author, and overall a true genius in his craft. Born in the metropolitan city of Guadalajara on 19th October 1964 and raised in a strict Catholic household, something that directly affected how he goes about when directing a film. Growing up with a fascination to capture moments from his life, with making short films with his toys when he was just 8 years old, which then led to him making numerous short films with a knack for the fantasy and horror genre, a particular category of movies that gave him and numerous other directors of those genres to tackle hard-hitting and sensitive topics like authoritarianism and religion. Other than taking huge influence from fairy tales and Universal's monster horror, another facet of his films is finding beauty in the grotesque, infusing those vastly different elements to provide something truly unique. And all of that mixed with heavily leaning towards using practical special effects and a dominant color palette makes all of his films a sublime experience to behold. Even though he is associated with all sorts of creative works, from writing novels to featuring in video games, the one I wanted to focus on, which I believe it's him at his best, is fantasy horror films, being the driving force of that genre, defining it to such an extent that he makes it something of his own. And it all started in 1993, when he wrote and directed his first feature-length film, Chronos, starring actors like Federico Lupi and Ron Perlman, with Lupi playing the character of Jesus Grease, an old antique dealer who gets bitten by a mechanical spider-like device which injects some unknown solution inside of him. And that helps him regain his youth, from his skin losing the wrinkles to his hair starting to become more thick, but at the cost of him getting urges to drink blood, being disgusted by that in the beginning, but eventually succumbs to those temptations, secretly using that device to feel young. While he is dealing with all of that, we are introduced to Angel, played by Pearlman, a greedy individual who helplessly undertakes all the abuse from his uncle just so he can get inheritance, while his uncle has been researching about the Archangel statue that grants eternal life, the device which is with the antique dealer. So Angel's uncle sends him to his store to buy that from him, which he, of course, doesn't want to sell, for obvious reasons. This pretty much sums up the premise of this film. It is basically the origin story of a vampire, a grounded to reality version of that, focusing on the human psyche rather than the superpower aspects of that character. Even though our protagonist was blinded by the powers of that device, he didn't use it for selfish acts, but to provide for his family more efficiently, and was more than willing to give up that device after witnessing the disadvantages that comes with such power. And our antagonists being businessmen, with Angel accepting everything that his uncle did to him in the hopes of receiving some inheritance, and his uncle chasing for immortality throughout his life. Just two extremely shallow people. I have said in my past videos that I'm not a huge fan of the monster horror genre, but Del Toro's take on the whole concept really intrigued me, taking a classic tale and reimagining it in such a humanly way makes it a timeless piece of art. 8 years later, he was back with another classic story with his own twist to it, The Devil's Backbone, a gothic horror film set in the 1930s Spain, when the country was going through a civil war, in which Caceres and Carmen are operating a small home for the orphans in a remote part of the country, who are assisted by Hasanito, the groundskeeper, and his fiancée, Conchita, a teacher. The owners are in support with the Republican group, which makes them a subject to numerous attacks from Francisco Franco's troops, and a faulty bomb that they tried to bomb them with, which now sits in their courtyard. Soon we are introduced to Carlos, an orphan whose father was killed during the war, so two Republican loyalists brought him to the orphanage, so Carmen and her co-workers can look after him. He has a tough time getting along with the other kids, but eventually strikes up friendships with some interesting characters to say the least. One of them shares a story about a missing boy, Santi, who disappeared on the day when the bomb was dropped on the courtyard. And all these adventures revolving around the group of boys are the best segments of this whole film. Although they are child actors, all of them display amazing and heartfelt performances, showcasing another brutal side of what war brings. Hundreds of kids becoming homeless and losing their parental guidance, as this movie perfectly visualizes how the orphans try their utmost best to make most out of everything. This isn't the only part the movie shines in. The charming Carmen and wickedly cunning Caceres are an absolute wonder to witness, and them being who they are makes the interactions with the kids absolutely amazing. Even if the whole film at its base is a ghost story taking place in a decrepit building, one of the oldest and overused trope in the horror genre, Del Toro's persistent focus on humans and how they deal with certain situations makes it feel refreshing, with the usual jabs towards religion and dictating rule of particular establishments, the former being used in Chronos and the latter was focused more in this film. The authentic outlook towards a young boy's ghost haunting a place set in a war-torn country, mixed with portraying how some institutions mentally fuck with individuals, makes it one of the saddest horror films that I've ever seen. With those two early titles from his filmography out of the way, which clearly proves that he had a passion for distinctive storytelling right from the beginning. I can finally move on to his indisputably one of the best films that he ever wrote and directed, Pan's Labyrinth, a dark fantasy tale with horror elements, releasing 5 years after The Devil's Backbone and sharing various similarities with that title, from taking place in the same timeline to addressing and continuing similar themes. The story revolves around Ophelia, daughter of Carmine, and her new stepfather, Captain Vidal, a strict follower and believer of Franco's ideologies, and was firmly against the Republicans, assigned by his higher-ups to hunt them down. The narrative intertwines with the real and a mythical world, centered around an abandoned labyrinth habituated by various mystical creatures, which can be only seen by Ophelia. And one of those creatures, a fairy according to Ophelia, leads her to an ancient stone labyrinth, where she meets a faun, who proclaims that Ophelia is the reincarnation of Princess Moana, daughter of the underworld's king. The faun gives her a book containing 3 tasks, which, upon completion, will provide her with immortality. And this leads to some of the best scenes of this movie, displaying the otherworldly creativity of Del Toro. And all those chores acts as a means for advancing the character development of our protagonist, from showing incredible maturity towards her mother's illness worsening to giving in to some temptation, which causes various implications with her relationship with the faun. While she was busy dealing with that situation, we witness the brutality of Captain Vidal, who murders 2 local farmers even though they weren't posing any direct threat towards them, and endlessly torturing rebels who were fighting for the freedom of their people, even going to the lengths of killing the doctor after he euthanized a suffering captive rebel. Although the earlier titles had their own merits and had numerous moments of brilliance, Pan's Labyrinth is Del Toro's astonishing creative mind firing on all cylinders, continuing over what made his previous films so appealing and carrying on the beautiful messages that he touched on those past titles, but at the same time cranking up the visual aesthetics to an absolute ridiculous level. With a career spanning over almost 4 decades, there are numerous titles to discuss, but these 3 aforementioned films perfectly describes what type of director and person in general Del Toro is. From growing up in a religious family just to become a raging atheist, which he usually portrays in his movies, shedding a light on the downsides of having blinding faith towards those so-called people of God, to how he absolutely despises structural institutions, and how certain people take unwarranted advantage of that flawed system. 2 major facets that is prominent in almost all of his films, which is a lot. As previously mentioned, he loves to dabble his feet in every possible creative outlet, with some actually based preferences, but to focus on what he is known for, mainly being his earlier indie, fantasy/horror based films. All of them feature some sort of beautiful imagery taking place in a lush environment, a particular concept that made him popular. Personally, I prefer his older films, as they felt more personal to some extent. But that doesn't mean the newer titles or the mainstream ones are bad or can't compete with the films that he made in the past. Although his blockbuster-esque titles tend to perform a bit worse in terms of getting critical acclaim. But even those films feature the usual Del Toro tier of visual amazement and aren't sought in the sector of possessing great ideas. It doesn't matter if it's an independent work or backed up by wealthy sponsors. Both of them are usually based on pre-established works, from comic book adaptations to reimagination of old tropes or classic stories, sometimes being fairy tales, delivering them in such a way that he makes them feel something of his own, with his trademark move of featuring some sort of monster, which aren't there just for the sake of presenting some spooky, scary scenes, as Del Toro's films doesn't come under the horror genre in its traditional sense. Yes, some of the characters look like they're the stuff of nightmares, but most of the time, they have a bigger meaning behind them. He loves to use monsters as a means for portraying messages and dealing with topics that are considered a bit touchy. And those sensitive themes, mixed with displaying striking visuals, gives his films a horror-like feel. Those frightening monsters becoming a catalyst for focusing on humans and their emotions. However, there are some titles that didn't excite me as much as the others did. But I'll still take Del Toro at his worst than what the rest of mainstream Hollywood has to offer. And what separates him from all those people is the constant drive to outdo himself in terms of making something distinct from his past works, even if there are certain themes that are prominent in his entire filmography. But the way he uses those concepts makes them feel vastly different from the last one. And this is what makes his films stand out from all the lookalikes that we get nowadays. Del Toro's love for taking risks in terms of creating something unique every time is what makes him and his work so effective to me. As without that, he would be another boring and bland director who tries to follow every popular trend. But seeing that he still has that passion for creativity alive inside of him and the desire to branch out to various artistic outlets keeps me hopeful for the future. As the dominance of Del Toro over whatever genre he chooses to delve into is not going to be over anytime soon.